How did the medieval blacksmith really live? Are you ready to learn the truth about a life that was all hell on earth, where every day could be your last, and comfort was not just a luxury but a pipe dream? Forget everything you've seen in movies and read in romantic sagas. Get ready to plunge into the harsh, disgusting, and unbearable reality of everyday existence of a man whose hands forged the foundation of the medieval world. Close your eyes and you will probably see a magnificent picture in your mind's eye. A mighty blacksmith standing at an anvil, his muscles playing under his shiny skin and sparks flying like stars, illuminating the semi-darkness of the workshop. You can hear the mighty clang of a jetty beating rhythmically against metal, feel the heat of a bugle burning your cheeks, and smell the heady smell of hot iron. You can imagine him creating swords for valiant knights, wrought iron gates for impregnable castles, and horseshoes for noble steeds with a noble calm. It is an image of power, skill, and indispensability that is firmly ingrained in our minds through chivalrous novels, epic movies, and fantasy games. It is a symbol of perseverance, romance, and inviolability. But what if I told you that this image is just a thin veil woven from myths and romantic fantasies, having almost nothing to do with the harsh, often disgusting, but surprisingly inventive reality of everyday life inside a real middle-century forge? What if everyday existence there was a constant, exhausting struggle for survival, where every day was a challenge and comfort was absolute luxury? Are you ready to put aside the myths and look behind the massive oak doors to see what the inhabitants of these smoky walls really smelled like? What they ate, how they slept, and what they struggled with just to live another day? The answers lie in yellowed chronicles, archaeological digs, and the writings of historians who piece by piece reconstruct a picture that is far from glossy. This is a story about a world where dampness and dirt were ubiquitous, and food could be deadly, where the absence of gigi often gave rise to diseases, and the craft itself turned into a complex survival mechanism. Stay tuned and you'll learn why a medieval blacksmith could lose all his teeth by the age of 30, how the constant rumble of a hammer turned him deaf, why any scratch could be a death sentence, why did blacksmiths have to drink beer instead of water, why were their lungs filled with soot. This is a journey into the heart of medieval fortitude, a veritable medieval forge hell. Imagine a life in which tooth loss was not just an unpleasant phenomenon, but an inevitable and painful reality that occurs long before old age when a person was barely 30-40 years old. A medieval blacksmith worked daily in extreme and constant heat radiated from a red-hot forge, the temperature in which could reach thousands of degrees Celsius. Such heat can melt metal, and what can we say about the human body? This unbearable heat, combined with the constant exposure to aggressive fumes containing microscopic metal particles, toxic scale, caustic soot, and other toxic compounds that were released during the processing of iron and the burning of low-quality charcoal, slowly but surely destroyed tooth enamel. The acidic environment created by these fumes literally corroded the teeth, making them brittle and vulnerable. Add to this the lack of even primitive oral hygiene. No toothbrushes, pastes, or mouthwashes that we take for granted today. People of that time very rarely brushed their teeth, and if they did, they used improvised means, such as hard herbs, pinches of ash, or even sand, which could do more harm than good, scratching the enamel and gums. And of course, a lean and rough diet that was far from balanced nutrition. The basis was hard, often poorly baked bread with admixtures of straw and husks, coarse, poorly cooked cereals, and rare sinewy pieces of hard meat, which required intensive and long overeating. This diet was catastrophically poor in vital vitamins and minerals, such as calcium and vitamin D, essential for bone and tooth health. The result was predictable and terrible. By the age of 30 or 40, most blacksmiths had serious problems with their teeth, including rotting to the roots, spontaneous loss, chronic abscesses and phlegmons of the maxillofacial region, and eventually complete edentia, loss of all teeth. Imagine an elderly, emaciated blacksmith who, despite having no teeth, tries to eat rough, chewable food. This was not just an inconvenience, but a constant, aching, nagging pain, incessant torment from gum inflammation, fluxes, and suppuration, as well as the threat of slow starvation exhaustion, as the body could not absorb enough nutrients due to undigested food. His mouth was an eternal, open wound, and every meal turned into a source of suffering that brought him closer to death. For the medieval blacksmith, chronic, debilitating, piercing pain was not an exception, but an everyday norm of existence. His body was his main, only and irreplaceable tool, and he ruthlessly exploited it, pushing it to the limit of physical capabilities that go beyond human endurance. Lifting heavy, red-hot ingots of iron, each of which could weigh tens of kilograms, without any lifting mechanisms, only at the expense of brute physical force. This was followed by many hours of monotonous, but at the same time requiring a huge effort. Swings with a hammer weighing 5 or 10 kilograms, and sometimes more, performed with incredible frequency and accuracy. Added to this were constant bending, twisting, and unnatural asymmetrical postures at the anvil, which led to catastrophic, premature wear of all joints, especially the shoulder, elbow, wrist, and knee, destruction of the spine, intervertebral discs, and all muscle groups throughout the body. By middle age, and sometimes much earlier, the blacksmith inevitably suffered from severe degenerative forms of arthritis and osteoarthritis, when the cartilage in the joints was completely worn off and the bones rubbed against each other, causing unbearable pain. Added to this were chronic sciatica, protrusions, and herniated discs that squeezed nerve endings, causing shooting pains all over the body. Muscle spasms, neuralgia, sprains, and torn ligaments were his constant companions. Every movement, every blow of the hammer was filled with a sharp, unbearable pain. Without access to any effective painkillers, aspirin, morphine, and others would not be available until much later. Without physical therapy, massage, or even the possibility of proper rest and recovery, the blacksmith was forced to work through a constant, piercing pain that never let go until his worn-out, mutilated body was completely destroyed. It didn't fail. Even at night, the pain wouldn't let up, robbing him of much-needed sleep, turning every attempt at sleep into torture. He fell asleep and woke up in pain, and she was his only faithful companion until the day he died. His body was a living torture chamber for him, and his life was an endless, never-ending agony, in which every breath and every movement was a reminder of his suffering. The blacksmith's eyes, his most valuable and irreplaceable tool for precision work, were constantly subjected to a catastrophic, destructive effect comparable to a slow but inevitable execution. He spent hours, day after day, staring at the bright, blinding, unbearable light of white-hot metal, which emitted intense ultraviolet, UV, and infrared IR radiation. This radiation, equivalent to hours of direct sun exposure without protection, permanently damaged the retina, causing burns, macular degeneration, and loss of visual acuity. The lens of the eye became cloudy, leading to early cataracts that progressed to complete blindness. The lack of any eye protection, not to mention modern safety glasses, left him completely exposed to these deadly threats. In addition to the radiation, the air of the forge was constantly filled with microscopic but sharp particles of scale, metal dust, and razor-fine metal fragments that flew off the workpiece with each blow of the hammer. At the same time, searing incandescent sparks flew off from the hot metal, capable of burning through skin and flesh. Any of these particles, once in the eye, could cause a deep cut to the cornea, an ulcer, an abscess, or even a penetrating wound to the eyeball. In the absolute absence of basic sterility and the complete absence of qualified ophthalmological care, such injuries are almost guaranteed to lead to severe infections, suppuration, irreversible damage to the optic nerve, and complete irreversible loss of vision in one or both eyes. Cataracts, corneal ulcers, and, in the worst cases, instant blindness caused by a spark in the eye or prolonged exposure to heat were terribly common. A blind blacksmith was completely useless for his craft, deprived of the opportunity to feed himself and his family, and became a burden to relatives and society. He was condemned to beggary, starvation, and a slow, painful death on the sidelines of life, losing not only his sight but all hope. His eyes, his life, everything was sacrificed to fire and metal. Medieval blacksmiths often worked with low-quality, crude iron and steel, which could contain significant impurities of lead, arsenic, mercury, cadmium, and other highly toxic heavy metals. When heated in the forge, these metals evaporated, forming toxic fumes and microparticles, which the blacksmith constantly inhaled without hindrance and also absorbed through the skin and mucous membranes. His body was slowly but surely accumulating these poisons. This led to chronic heavy metal poisoning, which manifested itself in a whole bunch of horrifying symptoms. Severe anemia, persistent weakness and shortness of breath, damage to the central and peripheral nervous system, tremors, muscle weakness, coordination disorders, decreased intelligence, irreversible personality changes, mental disorders, severe digestive problems, chronic abdominal pain, constipation, diarrhea, hair and teeth loss, bone destruction, liver damage, kidneys, and liver. He was literally poisoned at work, day after day, slowly and painfully fading from the inside, without any hope of treatment. His body became a repository of poisons, and his life became an endless poison. The air in the medieval forge was saturated not only with soot and smoke, but also with an invisible poison. Each inhalation was a step towards self-poisoning. When metals were heated in the furnace to high temperatures, necessary for their forging, not only the base metal, but also various impurities were evaporated. For example, lead, which was often present in iron ore or added to improve foundry properties, began to evaporate at relatively low temperatures, forming lead dust and vapors that settled on all surfaces, including the skin and mucous membranes of the blacksmith. Arsenic, another common pollutant, was even more insidious. Its compounds, even in low concentrations, had a devastating effect on internal organs, causing chronic inflammation and degenerative changes. Mercury, although less commonly found in raw materials, could enter the forge from other sources or as part of alloys, and its vapors were extremely toxic to the nervous system. In addition to inhalation, heavy metals entered the blacksmith's body through contact with the skin. The soot and dust covering his hands and face contained microparticles of these metals. Through microcracks, cuts, and abrasions, which were inevitable in the work of a blacksmith, poisons entered the blood, bypassing the protective barriers of the digestive and respiratory systems. The blacksmith constantly touched his face and mouth with dirty hands, which led to the absorption of metals with food and water. Even the water he drank in the blacksmith shop might have been contaminated by the metal dust that had settled from the air. The accumulation of these poisons in the body was systemic and irreversible. Lead, for example, accumulated in the bones, slowly releasing and poisoning the body throughout life. It affected the bone marrow, causing severe anemia, in which the body could not produce enough red blood cells to carry oxygen. This led to constant weakness, shortness of breath even with small loads, and pale skin. Her nails and hair were brittle, and her skin was dry and dull. The effect on the nervous system was one of the most terrible manifestations of poisoning. Blacksmiths often suffered from tremors, hand tremors, muscle weakness, and coordination problems, which made their work even more dangerous. Gradually, cognitive impairments developed, decreased memory, concentration, and intelligence. The blacksmith's personality changed. He became irritable, aggressive, prone to sudden mood swings, depression, and in severe cases, mental disorders and even dementia. These changes not only destroyed him, but also negatively affected his relationships with his family and society. The digestive system also suffered. Chronic abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, constipation alternating with diarrhea were common. Metals affected the mucous membrane of the stomach and intestines, disrupting digestion and absorption of nutrients, which worsened anemia and general exhaustion of the body. Cases of lead colic have been reported, where lead poisoning has caused excruciating abdominal cramps that mimic acute surgical conditions. The loss of hair and teeth was another outward manifestation of internal destruction. Metals disrupted metabolic processes in the body, weakening hair follicles and destroying tooth enamel and gums. Blacksmiths often lost their teeth at a relatively young age, making it difficult to eat and adding to their overall exhaustion. Bone destruction was the result of direct exposure to metals that replaced calcium in bone tissue, making the bones brittle and prone to fractures. The blacksmiths suffered from constant pain in their bones and joints, which made their movements stiff and painful. Damage to the kidneys and liver, the organs responsible for detoxification and elimination of toxins from the body, was critical. Heavy metals accumulated in these organs, causing their gradual destruction. Renal and hepatic insufficiency led to the accumulation of toxins in the blood, which manifested itself in the form of chronic fatigue, edema, jaundice, pruritus, and eventually coma and death. The life of a medieval blacksmith exposed to heavy metal poisoning was a slow fade. He could see his body failing, his mind dimming, without any hope of relief. The only cure was to stop working, but for most that would mean starvation and poverty. He was trapped in his profession, his body loads a repository of poisons, and his life an endless poison. With each passing day, he was sinking deeper into the abyss of ills, slowly but surely approaching the inevitable end, foreshadowing excruciating agony. These occupational diseases were not just an inconvenience, but a slow death sentence that deprived a person of physical and mental strength long before old age. He was doomed to suffer as he watched his life slowly slip through his fingers, poisoned by unseen enemies hidden at the heart of his craft. In medieval society, there were no concepts of weekends, vacations, normalized working hours, or paid sick leave. The blacksmith, like most artisans and peasants, worked from dawn to dusk every day, except on rare, strictly regulated church holidays. If there was an urgent or large order, for example for a feudal lord or the army, he could work at night without interruption by the light of a splinter or fire. Constant, chronic lack of sleep, physical exhaustion, lack of opportunities for adequate recuperation and regeneration of the body were the absolute norm. This led to constant, unbearable fatigue, exhaustion of the nervous system, irritability, aggression, apathy, as well as a sharp increase in the risk of mistakes at work, which could lead to serious injuries or damage to expensive material. His body was under constant stress, his immune system was depressed, and his life was a continuous series of heavy physical exertions. He was a perpetually tired, haggard, and broken man whose body and mind were never at peace. The life of a medieval blacksmith was an endless cycle of grueling labor that began with the first rays of the sun and ended only with the onset of complete darkness. The concept of working day was synonymous with all day, excluding time for the most necessary physiological needs. For a blacksmith whose work required enormous physical effort and concentration, the lack of adequate rest had disastrous consequences. His day started long before most people woke up. He needed to light the forge, which was a laborious task in itself, requiring effort and time. Then he would get to work, which consisted of standing for hours, lifting and moving weights, and countless hammer blows. Each blow required not only strength, but also accuracy, which in conditions of fatigue became an impossible task. Working in the blacksmith shop was accompanied by high temperatures, noise, and dust, which put an extra strain on his body. When night fell, his work might not end. Urgent orders, especially from the nobility or for military purposes, meant working late into the night under the dim light of oil lamps or torches. Under such lighting conditions, the risk of injury increased many times, and lack of sleep worsened fatigue, making movements less accurate and increasing the likelihood of mistakes. Such periods of complete insomnia could last for several days at a time, leaving the blacksmith on the verge of physical and nervous exhaustion. Constant physical exhaustion led to chronic muscle aches, joint pain, and back pain. His body was literally broken by the end of each day. The muscles did not have time to recover. Lactic acid accumulated, which aggravated the pain and feeling of fatigue. This led to degenerative changes in the joints and spine, making his movements stiff and painful, and accelerating the aging process of the body. The blacksmith's emotional and psychological state also suffered. Constant fatigue caused irritability and aggression. He easily lost his temper, was prone to conflicts. Then there could be apathy, complete indifference to what is happening, loss of interest in life. His motivation decreased, which affected his performance and quality of life. He was under constant stress as his body was in survival mode, producing excess stress hormones such as cortisol. This in turn suppressed the immune system, making it more vulnerable to infections and diseases. Even a common cold could cause serious complications due to a weakened immune system. In the conditions of a medieval blacksmith shop, where dirt, dust, soot, and lack of any sanitary standards reigned, even the most insignificant cut, burn, or ordinary callus on the hands of a blacksmith was a potential imminent death sentence. The lack of antibiotics, which would only be available in hundreds of years, and basic knowledge about sterility meant that even a tiny scratch could quickly turn into a severe purulent abscess, phlegmon, or led to sepsis, fatal blood poisoning. The burned skin became an ideal breeding ground for bacteria. Deep wounds from tools or incandescent metal festered, causing unbearable pain, high fever, delirium, gangrene, and ultimately agonizing death. Even if death was avoided, it was often necessary to resort to primitive, painful amputations without anesthesia to stop the spread of infection, which deprived the blacksmith of the ability to work and condemned him to beggary. The blacksmith literally risked his life and limbs with every blow of the hammer, and his body was a constant battleground with invisible, deadly enemies. The working environment of a medieval blacksmith shop was a hotbed of infection. The floor was dirt, constantly covered with dust, soot, metal filings, and waste. Humidity, the heat from the furnace, and the lack of ventilation created ideal conditions for the growth of bacteria, including those that cause tetanus, Clostridia, which could be present in the soil. The tools used by the blacksmith were dirty and never sterilized. They were covered in rust, dirt, and bacteria. The daily work of a blacksmith was associated with a constant risk of injury. These could be burns from hot metal or embers, cuts from sharp edges of workpieces or tools, abrasions from friction on rough surfaces, bruises from accidental hammer blows. Even the most insignificant scratch, which in modern conditions heals without consequences, for a medieval blacksmith could become a gateway to a deadly infection. As soon as the skin was damaged, the bacteria always present on the skin, in the air, and on tools immediately entered the wound. The immune system, weakened by hard work, malnutrition, and poisoning, often failed to cope with the onslaught of microbes. As a result, even a small wound quickly became inflamed and began to fester. This led to the formation of abscesses, limited accumulations of pus, or phlegmon-spilled purulent inflammations that quickly spread through the tissues, causing severe pain, swelling, and redness. Burns were particularly dangerous ojagi. Burned skin lost its protective barrier, and open wounds became an ideal breeding ground for pathogenic bacteria. A moist, warm environment and necrotic, dead tissues created a breeding ground for microorganisms, which led to the rapid development of infection. Burned limbs often became a source of gangrene, necrosis of tissues, accompanied by a black or green color and a disgusting smell. The symptoms of the infection were horrific. In addition to the unbearable pain in the wound itself, the blacksmith had a high fever, chills, general weakness, and nausea. In severe cases, delirium, and impaired consciousness developed. If the infection was not localized and entered the bloodstream, sepsis or blood poisoning developed. It was a deadly condition in which bacteria and their toxins spread throughout the body, causing systemic inflammation, multiple organ failure, and, in most cases, a painful death. Without antibiotics and modern medical intervention, sepsis was almost always fatal. The only salvation from the spread of infection, which was known to medieval doctors, often barbers or healers, was the amputation of the affected limb. These operations were performed without anesthesia, with primitive, non-sterile instruments, which in itself was torture. If the blacksmith experienced amputation, he became disabled, unable to perform his heavy work. He was condemned to begging and dependence on the charity of others, which in the Middle Ages often meant starvation. A blacksmith's house, if there was one at all, and not just part of the smithy, was usually located next to the hearth of his work and was completely saturated with smoke, soot, and the smell of burning. Often it was a one-room, primitive shack built of raw wood, clay, and straw, poorly isolated from the outside world. In winter it was bitterly cold, and in summer it was unbearably stuffy and damp. There was no ventilation, and the air was heavy and musty. Hygiene was at zero level. Water was scarce, and clean drinking water was rare. There was no sewage system. All the waste was thrown directly into the street or into cesspools. Baths were an unaffordable luxury. This created ideal conditions for the reproduction of parasites, fleas, lice, bedbugs, rodents, insects, and the rapid spread of deadly diseases such as dysentery, typhoid, and plague. He lived in constant filth and unsanitary conditions. His body was home to parasites, and his life was an endless struggle with dirt and germs. The living conditions of a medieval blacksmith were, to put it mildly, Spartan, and most often simply barbaric. His abode, if it was any different from the smithy itself, was not a shelter, but rather an extension of his unfavorable work environment. Located in the vicinity of the forge, his house was constantly saturated with the acrid smell of sulfur, metal dust, and soot. Such an atmosphere not only created discomfort, but also constantly irritated the respiratory tract, exacerbating health problems. The structure of the dwelling itself was extremely primitive. It was often a one-room hut built with the most affordable materials: rough logs, loosely held together with clay, and thatched roofs. Such a structure provided minimal protection from the weather. In winter, the cracks were bitterly cold. In summer, the hut was an oven chamber filled with unbearable heat and dampness. The lack of windows and doors that were loosely closed made ventilation almost impossible. The air inside was heavy and musty, heavy with the smell of sweat and sewage. Water was a valuable resource that was used sparingly. Regular body washing was out of the question. Clean drinking water was rare, and it was often necessary to drink water from wells or rivers contaminated with waste. This led to the spread of intestinal infections. The lack of sanitation was one of the main causes of unsanitary conditions. All waste was thrown directly into the street or into cesspools. These open drains became breeding grounds for pathogenic bacteria and viruses. The smell was unbearable and attracted hordes of flies, rats, and mice that carried infections. Baths and washing were rare. Most people bathed once every few months, which contributed to the reproduction of parasites on the body. Fleas, lice, bedbugs were constant companions. They not only caused itching, but also carried deadly diseases, such as typhoid and plague. Many blacksmiths in the Middle Ages were serfs or economically dependent on the feudal lord. They didn't own their land, their forge, or even their time. The feudal lord could demand work from them without adequate pay, only for the right to live on the land and use the blacksmith shop, or for minimal food. Their work was valued, but the blacksmith himself could be reduced to the level of a property object, over which the feudal lord had almost unlimited power. If he refused to work, was unable to do it due to illness or old age, or tried to leave, he could be severely punished, exiled, deprived of his only source of livelihood, and condemned to starvation or slavery. Blacksmiths were at the very bottom of society. They had no rights or legal protection. They were completely disenfranchised. The position of the blacksmith in medieval society was extremely precarious and dependent. Despite the vital role he played, his social status was extremely low. Most blacksmiths were in some form of serfdom with the landowner, which meant that they were attached to the land and could not leave it without the permission of their master. Their smithy, as a rule, did not belong to them, but was the property of the feudal lord, who provided it to the blacksmith for use. In return, it was required to perform certain works and pay a fee. This put the blacksmith in complete economic dependence. He was not free to sell his wares on the market, as his labor and his products primarily belonged to his master. A plata trude blacksmith's wages were often not in the form of money, but in the form of natural exchange. The right to live on land, use the forge, and sometimes in a minimum ration, which was barely enough to support existence. If the feudal lord needed new armor or inventory repairs, the blacksmith was required to perform this work, often without any additional payment. His time and energy were entirely his master's. It was a form of hidden slavery. If a blacksmith refused to work, became ill, or grew old, he could be mercilessly expelled. This meant losing your only source of income, your home, and your livelihood. Exile often meant starving to death or having to seek alms. In some cases, he may have been sold as a slave. Thus, the medieval blacksmith was at the very bottom of society. He had no rights, no legal protection. He was completely disenfranchised in the face of his master. His life was a constant struggle for survival, where his work was valuable, but he was only a tool in the hands of those who had power and land. This created an atmosphere of constant fear and humiliation, depriving the blacksmith of any hope of improving his fate. Despite the grueling, hard physical labor that required a huge amount of energy and calories, the blacksmith often did not have enough food to support his body. The basis of his diet was low-calorie cereals, bad bread, cereals, vegetables, and legumes. Meat was an extremely rare item, available only on great holidays. Unless the blacksmith lived in the castle and received a meager ration, harvest could be poor due to weather conditions, food supplies could be disrupted due to wars or diseases, and food prices could be prohibitively high. Chronic malnutrition and hunger were a daily reality. This led to exhaustion of the body, beriberi, severe weakening of the immune system, making it extremely vulnerable to any disease, and deprived it of the strength to perform work. He was constantly experiencing unbearable hunger pangs, and this was not just a discomfort, but a factor that was slowly but surely killing him. Working as a blacksmith required a huge amount of energy. Lifting heavy work pieces, working with a hammer for many hours, and maintaining a high body temperature all burned thousands of calories a day. In modern conditions, such work would have required a high-calorie diet, but the medieval blacksmith was deprived of such an opportunity. His diet was meager and monotonous. The basis was made up of cereals, poorly baked bread, various types of cereals. These foods provided energy, but were poor in protein, fat, vitamins, and minerals. Vegetables and legumes were available, but their quantity and variety depended on the season and crop. Meat was a rare delicacy, available only on big holidays. The lack of meat and dairy products led to a lack of animal protein, which is necessary for muscle growth and repair. This compounded the physical exhaustion. Beriberi was widespread. The lack of vitamins led to numerous health problems: weakness, bleeding gums, tooth loss, vision problems. The worst consequence of malnutrition was a severe weakening of the immune system. The exhausted body could not effectively fight off infections. Any disease could become a deadly threat. The blacksmith was extremely vulnerable to any illness, and his chances of recovery were minimal. Malnutrition also left him too weak to do his job. Fatigue and weakness became constant companions, reducing his productivity and increasing the risk of injury. He was trapped. He needed to work to survive, but the work was draining him, and there was not enough food to recover, which created a vicious cycle leading to an early death. The Middle Ages were an era of constant wars, feudal feuds, robberies, and epidemics. The blacksmith, as a supplier of vital weapons, armor, tools, and equipment, was an integral part of the war machine, but it was constantly under direct threat. His forge, as a valuable asset, could be looted, burned, and he himself killed, maimed, or enslaved during raids. In the event of a siege of a castle or city, he could be called upon to forge weapons and repair armor day and night, without rest, in conditions of severe shortage of water, food, and materials, under the threat of starvation or attack by enemies. His life depended entirely on the outcome of wars and battles that he could not control. He was constantly surrounded by fear, living in an atmosphere of instability and violence, where death could come at any moment at the hands of the enemy, disease, or starvation. The Middle Ages were a period of incessant conflict. The feudal lords were constantly at war with each other. There was also a threat from robbers and bandits. All this instability directly affected the blacksmith's life. During robber raids or military campaigns, the smithy could be looted and burned to the ground. All the equipment could be destroyed overnight. The blacksmith himself risked being killed, maimed, or enslaved. He could be taken into slavery, deprived of his family and everything he had. When a blacksmith's castle or town was besieged, his life became a nightmare. He was required to forge weapons and repair armor day and night without interruption. The work was carried out in conditions of the most severe shortage of resources. Water, food, and materials were strictly rations. He worked under the constant threat of shelling, starvation, and the fall of the fortress. Exhaustion, stress, and malnutrition were pushing him to the limit. The outcome of wars and battles that he couldn't control directly determined his fate. Victory meant temporary safety. Defeat could lead to complete ruin, loss of everything, and even death. The blacksmith was just a pawn in a big game where his life depended on decisions and the outcome of battles. Constant exposure to such an atmosphere gave rise to incessant fear. Fear for your life, for the life of your family, for your home. He lived in a state of chronic anxiety, knowing that at any moment his world could collapse. This instability and violence were an integral part of his daily reality. Death could come from anywhere, at the hands of the enemy, from disease or from starvation. The life of a medieval blacksmith was a constant challenge to survival, where peace and security were only fleeting moments, and death was always at your back. Thus, the life of a medieval blacksmith was far from a romantic adventure, but an endless hell on earth, a grueling struggle for survival, full of dangers, hardships, and inhuman labor. Every hammer blow, every spark, every piece of hot metal, it was all part of a harsh reality in which there was no room for weakness, compassion, or rest. He survived because of his remarkable physical strength, incredible endurance, impeccable skill, and deep intuitive knowledge of his craft. He was an indispensable link in the chain of medieval society, but his indispensability did not bring him wealth, an easy life, or even extreme comfort. Why is it so shitty to be a medieval blacksmith? Because his life was the epitome of the cruelty and ruthlessness of that era. He was a slave to his craft, his own fraying body, and the harsh conditions in which he had to live. His skill was both a blessing and a curse, for it bound him to the red-hot furnace for the rest of his life, until his body failed and his spirit broke. And yet, despite all these inhumane hardships, it was people like the medieval blacksmith who forged not only iron with their incredible will and hard labor, but also the Middle Ages themselves, leaving behind a legacy that we still study and admire. Their survival was not just an act of perseverance, but a real feat of spirit in conditions that seem unimaginable to us, modern people. If you want to learn even more shocking facts about everyday life in the Middle Ages, subscribe to our channel and don't miss the new videos.